I want to begin. You were listening in and you heard the comments there from Ukraine's foreign minister. I'm interested in your perspective on this, saying downplaying, as other Ukrainian leaders have done, downplaying seemingly the threat from Russia. Why?
Well, I think the Ukrainians are messaging here to Moscow that they are not going to let themselves be provoked in any way that would give Moscow an excuse and suggest that it was only reacting with any form of military incursion. That's how I'm reading Ukrainian messaging.
Okay. And it's interesting today to have Ukrainian representation at that table. It's not just Russia, U.S. as it was at the end of last week. So Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany. The fact that Ukraine has a representative there to negotiate today, what is the significance of that?
Well, look, the Normandy format was established, I think, in 2014 around the illegal annexation of Crimea to attempt to bring down tensions in the Donbass, where you had Russian proxies, so-called separatists, quote unquote, fighting Ukrainians. They're still fighting with, I think, a total of more than 13,000 fatalities at this point. And so I think the Normandy format has never been particularly successful, not least because the Russians were never willing to admit that this was not a civil war, as they were saying, but really a Russian-supported aggression against Ukraine.
So if the Normandy format was unsuccessful in the past, one questions then the purpose of today. The meeting today is of diplomatic advisors. What do you think is the possible outcome of this?
Well, let's distinguish between the purpose and the outcome. I think the purpose is to reinsert Germany and France into the discussions with Russia and Ukraine. That's not wrong. They're not in any way breaking out of allied consensus here. There has been close coordination on sanctions, messaging and diplomacy between Washington, Ottawa, and European capitals, and that continues to be the case. I don't think there's any freelancing going on here. I think the other purpose of these conversations is, frankly, to keep the Russians talking. So far, the Russians have rejected Western offers of talking about missile defense, about confidence-building measures, exercises, that kind of thing. And the Russians have reiterated their, truly outrageous demands that they laid out in these two draft treaties that they published before Christmas, and of course increased their troops around 3 borders of Ukraine. So again, I think that this is a play for time. That's not illegitimate, but if you were asking about the outcome, I don't expect this to yield much in terms of tangible outcomes. I would be quite surprised.
I'd like to ask specifically about some of the countries at that table. France, President Macron, for example, going to speak on Friday with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and he continues to affirm France's belief, and this is a quote from officials, there is space for diplomacy and a path to de-escalation. Do you see one?
Well, as I was just saying, it seems to me that Russian rhetoric has been extraordinarily belligerent and intransigent on these issues. Remember when the Russians put out those 2 treaty drafts, one for a treaty with the US, one with NATO, in which basically really the Kremlin was telling us that they wanted to roll back the European security order to about 1997 or earlier. I think ultimately with the goal of pushing America out of Europe. Those were demands that for no NATO member, except perhaps 1 or 2 who are particularly close to Russia, naming no names here.
Non-starters.
Yeah, non-starters, exactly. I think that is, I think we're at a dead end there. And so it's not clear to me that the Russians really have a way of getting down the extremely tall flagpole that they have climbed up on without military action.
Having to do something. increasingly hearing from Ukrainian Canadians, for example, they believe there is an inevitability to this. Germany's role at the table, if you could turn to that too, because it's interesting to watch that country, new chancellor, no Angela Merkel on the negotiating landscape now, and Olaf Scholz confronted with this. And there has been some, I think, concern expressed about the strength of Germany's position, maybe some ambiguity or ambivalence toward Russia at this time. So where do you see Germany's position and perhaps role in anything diplomatically in the future or now?
So there's two issues around which there has been confusion. One is sanctions and the role of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project in that context. And the other one is weapons deliveries. Let me start with the latter. The weapons deliveries issue is one where individual NATO nations, not NATO as such, have been quite continuously giving Ukrainians weapons and other means to defend themselves. Whereas the German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, on a visit last week to Kyiv said, we can't do that. And Germany has been criticized for that. The reason for this is that there is a passage in the coalition agreement that says no weapons deliveries into conflict zones. And that is because Germany is one of the biggest arms exporters in the world. And German arms exports finance keeping unit prices low for the German armed forces supplies, sadly. So this has been a long-standing issue for Germany's center-left parties. I think that that's not a position that remains tenable because this is not just any conflict zone, but you have an admittedly flawed democracy, Ukraine, staring down the barrel of an authoritarian aggressor from whom all the threats are emanating. So I expect this position, I think, to develop at some point. Nord Stream 2 is another matter. Germany and Europe are heavily energy dependent on for gas imports on Russia. And the Russians have been using a supply squeeze and a price squeeze to apply political pressure on Europe and on Germany, and have hinted very broadly that the current suspension of the certification of the pipeline, would, if that disappeared into thin air, then all the problems with gas supplies would disappear. I think we recognize blackmail when we see it. And so Chancellor Scholz has actually belatedly, but he has said that Nord Stream 2 is on the table in the economic sanctions package the West intends to apply if Russia attacks Ukraine. And
we certainly have heard from U.S. officials saying they're negotiating with global suppliers to make sure natural gas moves there, so there won't be a cold winter for those in Europe. I have time for just one last question, but I hope we'll be back to continue this conversation. Since we're talking about sanctions, there have been discussions over unprecedented sanctions in the face of this, but yesterday from the U.S. president, the threat that the U.S. would place personal sanctions on Vladimir Putin. And I'm wondering what that changes and what, if any, effect that could have.
Honestly, my understanding is that personal sanctions so far have been left out of the packages being discussed. And for one, because they're, I think, technically quite difficult to do. I'm not an expert on this, but am I for it? Yes. Do I think it's going to change a great deal about Russian thinking, Kremlin thinking here? I doubt it. And frankly, again, I just want to reiterate here that I have a distinct sense that the Kremlin and Putin himself have talked themselves into a corner and are probably unpleasantly surprised by the amount of Western cohesion they're seeing over their untenable demands.
To be continued, I hope. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I really appreciate it and learned a great deal from this conversation. Constanze Stelzenmüller, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you from Washington today.